Hey, everybody, welcome back. Here we are, section 3, talking about Pope Paul VI. He's a very interesting pope, very much one of the first of the modern popes, and so much changed under his leadership after Vatican II that he really had his chance to put his spin on almost everything. He dies in 1978, so he was pope for a good amount of time. He was from the Archdiocese of Milan in Italy, northern Italy, and he was the one who issued the Novus Ordo, or the New Order of Mass. So first, we call him the traveling pope. Do you remember when the Lateran Treaty was signed and the Pope called himself the prisoner of the Vatican, and he never left the Vatican from that point on? Well, Pope John the 23rd, for the last pope, he was the first pope to leave the Vatican. He got on trains and he traveled around Italy, visiting dioceses, visiting churches. So he was the first pope since the Lateran Treaty to leave. And now we have Pope Paul VI, who took that to new heights. 37-year long papacy, so it's pretty long. So he said Pope John the 23rd became the first pope since Pius XI to leave the walls of the Vatican, traveling around Italy, but it was Paul VI that would rewrite the status quo of papal travels during his pontificate. We could never imagine a pope that would just stay in the Vatican his whole time as pope. And that's because we have this model in Paul VI. Paul VI visited 6 continents as pope. That's pretty much all of them. There's nothing to go to Antarctica for. In his 15 years as pope, he traveled to over 20 countries, 9 apostolic journeys outside of Italy. He sprang up so many papal firsts during his time as pope. First pope to fly in an airplane, first pope to visit the Western Hemisphere. Paul VI was also the first pope to celebrate Mass in the Western Hemisphere, which, by the way, was held at Yankee Stadium, which is pretty good if you have to celebrate Mass somewhere where you can get a lot of people. One of his missions was this focus on ecumenism. We talked about ecumenism when we talked about Vatican II, this concept of Christians putting aside what divides us and reaching out and kind of connecting on what connects us. We used to look at other Christian churches as heretics and heresies, but that's not helpful. We know that there's not going to be a reunion of the Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church. We know there's not going to be a reunion with the Presbyterian Church and the Catholic Church. But that doesn't mean that we can't pray together. It doesn't mean that we can't share things together and be one in Christ with each other. And that's what ecumenism is all about. This is the Did You Know from here. In Monument Park at Yankee Stadium, there are plaques for many of the baseball players that played for the Yankees that were very good. And there's also 3 plaques. You can scroll on your iPad and see all 3. For the popes who celebrated Mass at Yankee Stadium. So there's a plaque for Pope Paul VI, there's one for John Paul II, and there's one for Pope Benedict XVI. They all 3 have held Mass at Yankee Stadium. So here we go. In the past, Catholics developed an attitude of spiritual exclusivity. Like I said, we wouldn't be allowed to go to other Christian weddings or other Christian celebrations. It was seen as participating in another faith. But this doesn't help us. This doesn't bring us together. By the 19th century, the church realized that keeping this attitude is contrary to the gospel. Ecumenism is the realization that Christians from other faiths share more in common than they differ in beliefs that separate their congregations and communities. Here we see Pope Francis with Patriarch Bartholomew I, I've mentioned him before, of Constantinople, together at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. This is the leader of the Catholic Church, and he is the leader, so to speak, of the Greek Orthodox Church. Remember the Great Schism? It was these 2 churches that split, but they're friends today. They're friends, they're allies. They have lifted the excommunications off each other. Well, that's happened in the past, but there's a need to realize what joins us, not what divides us. All Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox believe that Jesus Christ is Lord, we are saved by his grace, that we're called to love God with our heart, mind, strength, and soul, and love our neighbor as ourselves. And that's what ecumenism is all about. How do we come together to bring that to the world as followers of Christ and put our differences aside? It's what, putting aside what divides us. Paul's ecumenical sense was seen in action in the I don't know what the year is. This says 1965, when the Second Vatican Council was in session. Paul VI made a special, it was 1965. Paul VI went to Jerusalem to meet the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople. Now it's Bartholomew I. Back then it was Patriarch Athenagoras. And this was the first time that the Pope and the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople met since the Great Schism, since 1054. So it's almost 1,000 years had to go by before these two figures could speak with each other again. And the two men met to talk about this concept of ecumenism, of coming together to be one church in a sense. Did you know that the coat of arms of Paul VI hangs on our school building? That's because when Maria Regina High School was built, Paul VI was the Pope, and it's a common thing in the church where when you build a church building or a Catholic building, you put the seal of the bishop and the seal of the Pope, or the coat of arms of the bishop, the coat of arms of the Pope on the building. It's right by the Holy Family Shrine when you come in. Next time you see it, you'll know what it is. So these two men desired greater closeness, and on December 7th, 1965, they released the Catholic Orthodox Joint Declaration of 1965. In this document, the mutual excommunications were lifted from 1054. So back in 1054, when the Pope excommunicated the Patriarch and the Patriarch excommunicated the Pope, it stayed that way for about 1,000 years. And it wasn't until 1965 that these two declared that neither of them are excommunicated, but we are still in schism because there's just different leadership. There's different, it's different structured at this point, but we're closer today than we've ever been before. Paul VI wanted to address the crisis of faith in the 20th century. We talked about modernism in the past and these new isms in governments and things that societies are gravitating towards. The desire to move away from what it's like to be a monarch society or a feudal society, and the concept of self-governance and self-determination are very modern. And they wanted to put aside old traditions, and the church is always part of that when people think of putting aside things that are old. After the Second Vatican Council, Paul VI called for a year of faith to mark the 1900th anniversary of the martyrdoms of Saints Peter and Paul. During this year, he warned of a crisis of faith that he believed was creeping into the church because of the rejection of the traditional faith. A lot of times after the Second Vatican Council, when things changed, they changed really fast, and they didn't always change in the right way. Some people used the Second Vatican Council's changes to change more things than were called for. And this was not what the council envisioned, because the council in no way changed the faith itself. It merely changed the way we express it so it's more modern, more up to our current way of life. Modern versions of the faith try to explain Jesus' miracles with science. So they would say that, like, the story of the multiplication of the loaves and the fish, they would say, well, what probably happened was Jesus started to be generous and share the food that his apostles had, and everybody else really did have food, and they shared their own food too. That's probably what happened. Or they'll say that he didn't really walk on water. It probably just looked like he walked on water. It's probably like a low tide kind of a thing, and Peter thought he was walking on water, but he wasn't. And that's how modernists started to explain things of the faith. They also wanted to revise teachings of sin so that Christians no longer needed to worry about heaven or hell. Paul VI warned that modern Christianity will fail to satisfy the heart. If God can be explained by science, or if there is no understanding of sin or a relationship with Christ, then having faith in God and being called to be a member of the church altogether is pointless. Many disregarded Paul VI, his fears, as an overreaction to the attitudes following the Second Vatican Council. Unfortunately, Paul would be vindicated through the events in the upcoming decades. As in 1960s cultural revolution that took place throughout society. The authority of the church, of governments, other social leaders were called into question in the 1960s, largely rejected simply because it was the status quo. Again, the desire for modern ideas in government outweighed the desire to do what was right or do what was best. This led to a degrading in morality universally. In society, especially among the youth, sexual ethics were challenged hardest of all. Drug abuse increased as never before seen during this time period because people are just doing whatever they want. They're doing what they feel like doing because they feel like they have the freedom to do it. They're not following any moral compass, any sense of underlying principles that we live our lives by. We have this hopefully through Kellenberg and what it means to be one heart, one mind, especially during this time, through our handbook, our code of conduct of how we act. Teachers even have handbooks. I don't know if you know this, but there's a faculty handbook and there's rules of how faculty are supposed to do things and how we're supposed to dress, how we're supposed to, same thing for you guys. There's a code of conduct. It's not do whatever you want. But in the 1960s, people were throwing away all codes of conduct altogether and doing what they wanted without a moral code. From now on, anything a person wanted to do was permitted by society so long it didn't hurt or offend another person. Here's Paul VI at the Second Vatican Council. He's sitting on this big throne, this big chair. This is like a leftover thing that popes did because there were no television screens. There's no broadcasting back in the day. So when the Pope was out, you put him in the biggest chair you could find so people could see him. You dressed him as, in big vestments so people far, far away could see him. And the Pope's wearing this papal tiara up here. And popes used to wear these all the time. Not all the time. They took them off for things. But for ceremonies, the Pope wore this triple crown. And if you could see, there's a crown there, there's a crown there, and there's a crown there in this papal tiara. Here's Paul VI flying on an airplane. Nice guy. This is that same papal tiara. Some of you saw this when we went to Washington, D.C. on All Saints' Day this year. Paul VI took off the papal tiara during the Second Vatican Council, placed it on the altar, and walked away from it. And no pope since has worn the papal tiara. It's a symbol of the old ways. When the Pope was the king of the papal states, when there were more monarchies, but it's a symbol of times past. So popes no longer wear this. And this today is in Washington, D.C. You can go see this. It's down in the crypt where we ate our lunch. He's on a magazine cover. And this is at Yankee Stadium. You can see the old facade up here. They had Mass right here in the middle. And, this is packed. The Yankee Stadium held 56,000 people ordinarily, plus you fill in all these people down here. There's like 90,000 people all gathered for the first papal Mass in the Western Hemisphere. Here he is addressing the United Nations. Here he is meeting the first and only Catholic U.S. president, JFK, named after the airport in Brooklyn. This new attitude of having personal freedom and not following ethical rules or ethical laws or what was considered to be good in the past was done because people believed that these rules were a restraint on humanity. But rather, rules and laws enable us to be truly free. I think of the example of, why do we stop at stop signs? Because it enables us to have the freedom to drive safely. Why do we drive on the right side of the road instead of whatever side we want? Because it gives us the freedom to be safe. Rules are in place many times so that there is order and so that we have the ability to have the most freedom that we can. Sexual promiscuity may be desirable, but it leads to marital infidelity, which no one desires. Recreational use of drugs may not cause immediate harm, but after an addiction is formed, freedom once again is lost. Rushing into these things, rushing in to satisfy every pleasure that we have, it doesn't satisfy us ultimately. It's all momentary. It's all fleeting. So here comes the most controversial thing of Paul VI's papacy, the encyclical Humanae Vitae. Since ancient times, there have been means of contraception or birth control. People found that if they ate certain foods, ate certain drugs, that they could even abort a child before there were surgical methods of this. So in the 1960s, the first oral contraceptive, commonly referred to as the pill, was released by physicians and approved, and the church was petitioned to reevaluate the position on contraceptives. In the church, we don't believe that contraceptives have a place because it's contrary to what sexual intercourse is meant to be for. Many felt that since other Christian churches were permitting it, that the Catholic Church ought to do it too. So in 1963, John the 23rd assembled a committee to look at the matter. The committee couldn't agree on things. When it came time for the Pope to make a decision, Pope Paul VI consulted a committee with a well-known Archbishop of Krakow, Poland, named Karol Wojtyła. We know this is the future of St. John Paul II. John Paul II just authored a book on sexual ethics and the human person. And he made such an impact on Paul VI with this book, with his insight, that Paul VI invited him to come to Rome to help write his encyclical. The future saint would help Paul VI author the document that would become one of the church's primary teachings on sexual ethics in the modern era. So what does it say? And I think this is the most telling part of this encyclical. Humanae Vitae says 4 predictions that would happen if the world accepts artificial contraception on the grand scheme. 1, a general lowering of moral standards in society. And we think of 1968, and we think of what it's like today. A rise in marital infidelity. If we look at divorce rates, they've skyrocketed since for artificial contraception has become widespread. A loss of respect for women by men. Look at the Me Too movement from a year ago. That wasn't a thing. Men treated women differently. Women treated men differently. At our grandparents' generation, it's not the same as it was then. And coercive reproductive technologies by governments. There are governments that are forcing people to not have children. Like in China, there's a one-child rule, or there has been for years, because they want to manipulate what should be natural and should be the fruit of a marriage of love. Paul VI's encyclical reminded the church that the church, just because that someone has the power to do something, it doesn't mean they ought to do something. The gift of sexuality is given to us from our Creator. Sexual intimacy, therefore, has 2 purposes designed by God. It's both an expression of the fullness of love between husband and wife, and it is also a way in which new life is created out of that love. Removing either one of these from the act distorts the intention and the purpose of why God gifted humanity with sexuality. If a couple has sex just to have a kid and doesn't care about the love of each other, that's as wrong as if a couple has sex just to have it and doesn't want a child at all. The purpose designed by God is for it to be both unitive and procreative. In the last 50 years, since Humanae Vitae's predictions, they've undoubtedly come true. Paul VI was prophetic when he warned the world about what would happen if the moral and ethical values of the world were rewritten. These teachings are revealed to us by God, who designed our own being in his image and likeness. Changing them or rewriting them or abolishing them does not lead to greater human fellowship, charity, or happiness, but only to what he calls a culture of death. Lastly, up here in the Pope's own words from Humanae Vitae, marriage then is far from being the effect of chance or the result of a blind evolution of natural forces. It is in reality the wise and provident institution of God, the Creator, whose purpose was to effect in man his loving design. As a consequence, husband and wife, through that mutual gift of themselves, which is specific and exclusive to them alone, develop that union of 2 persons in which they perfect one another, cooperating with God in the generation and rearing of new lives. This is the beauty that we're trying to talk about and try to protect when the church speaks out on what can be misused when we decide we can do whatever we want for our own reasons. A little heavy into the day today. Humanae Vitae is extremely important. I would love to talk more about it, but we're going to get to a little bit more on those topics when we get to John Paul II, because he was so good with those kinds of things. Okay? Have a phenomenal weekend. There is no homework for us, as you know. If you need anything, you have any questions about anything, feel free to shoot me an email. And we'll talk to you guys again on Monday next week. Take care. Bye-bye.